I believe that we are now officially live. Thank you for joining us for our March Liberal Values Lab with our ILV director and acclaimed social worker, Zander Keig. Zander, thank you so much for being a part of this. The purpose of this lab is know thyself. So we know that when we're dealing with, particularly with ILV, with a lot of issues that are very hard to deal with, the first thing is taking care of ourselves and actually knowing where we're coming from so that we can interact in the right way with people who might think differently from us. So I appreciate you giving us, particularly with all the knowledge you have on this matter. So with that said, I will turn the mic over for you and you tell me when to bring up your slideshow.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. First, I want to say thank you for the invitation to present. I'm really happy to do that. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's, you would think that the things that I'm going to talk about are things that we should have learned along our lifespan, starting when we were children from our parents. But a lot of us were raised by parents who didn't have this skill set, that we're going to be talking about. And so when we're not learning it in school because we're focused on other things, and they're even focusing on other things now in school beyond the academics that most of us were trained in school. And the one thing, it's like if I could say one thing as a takeaway just to keep in your mind is the ability to make major changes in your life and in the world takes a lot of effort. A lot of us don't have the time and energy for that. And we're going to come up against all kinds of obstacles throughout life. There's no way to eradicate obstacles and challenges and conflict, but how we deal with it, right? How we respond rather than react to it is what we're going to delve into. So let's just do that now.
Okay, and before I show your screen, just a note to people who are watching this publicly but not a member of Circle, you can't comment, so we would invite you to become a member of Circle so you can. And if you are a member of Circle and watching this, there's a little comment chat box, so any questions for Zander, please put in there. And one other housekeeping note, Zander, before we get you started, is ILV is donor funded, so if anyone feels the spirit moved them with all but what we're offering, please go to ilvalues.org and donate and follow us on YouTube and all of our social media platforms.
That's right.
So there, with that, I am going to share your screen and let you go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It'll take just a moment for it to come up and then, so let's deal with technology right now.
It's coming. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Know Thyself presentation. My name is Zander Keig. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also one of the board members for Institute for Liberal Values. So it is a joy to be able to be here with you today to talk about all of these wonderful things. So let me just delve right in. I'm going to have the slide change now. This is just a little bit more about me, so you can see that. Again, I have an LCSW, I have a master's of social work. I also have a master's in conflict analysis and resolution, a bachelor's in interpersonal communication. I did study at a seminary and have a master's in world religions or theology. So that's just a little bit about my academic background. I'm almost 58 years old. I've been married for 19 years, in relationship with my wife for 22 years. We live in Florida. It's beautiful here. It rained a little bit this morning, but other than that, the weather has been beautiful. And I served in the U.S. Coast Guard. So that just gives you a little bit more about me, who I am as a person. Next slide, looking at the objectives. So this is my hope. My hope is that at the conclusion of this workshop, you'll be able to define things like worldview and core values, right? This is giving you a sneak peek into what we're going to be talking about. right? That you're going to be able to, not by the end of this, but I'll give you a link so that you can go further in your studies to find like what is your particular conflict management style or styles, right? Most of us have a primary, a secondary, maybe even a tertiary, but we have a particular default conflict management style. We might not be aware of what it is, but there's a little quiz you can take that'll give you that information. I want you to be able to locate resources for the purpose of self-reflection, right? To get to become more aware of yourself, right? Self-awareness is a component of emotional intelligence. So self-reflection is a piece of that. I want you to be able to identify the various elements of moral foundation. I'm not going to go into a lot of great detail on that. If you want to know more about moral foundations, read everything written by Jonathan Haidt, right? He's written a lot on moral foundations. And then what I hope you also get is the ability to recognize the importance of emotional resilience and mental fitness. That might be new for you, this concept of mental fitness. So if it is, you will understand more about what it means when we get to that portion of the workshop. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So here's an overview of what we're going to be talking about. Before I go into the details of that, I just want you to think about this concept of know thyself. A lot of you might be familiar, right, with this maxim, right? It's a Delphic maxim. It was one of the first three maxims inscribed in the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. I'm not even going to pretend to know what that means, but I'm just giving you right? This is an ancient Greek aphorism, right? So know thyself and nothing to excess and surety brings ruin are the primary three maxims of this Greek philosophy. So we're going to talk about worldview. What is your worldview? What are your core values? What's your moral foundation? What's your conflict management style? And we're also going to be looking at what the importance is of emotional resilience and mental fitness in your life. Again, it's kind of a recap from the objectives that's typical. So we don't need to belabor that. So we'll go to the next slide. And so we're going to start with the exploration of what is your worldview, right? Well, first let's describe worldview. A worldview is a set of basic assumptions about how the world works. That's what a worldview is. Other people refer to it as a paradigm, right? A set of basic assumptions about how the world works, right? So we're going to explore worldview challenges, right? These deeply embedded assumptions that we make about things and how things ought to be. So when we have a strong belief about something and something is happening around us that is outside of that or conflicts or challenges, that's when we might become emotionally engaged, right? We might be reacting to things. So for example, do we live in a material world, right, that can ultimately be described by scientific findings, or do we live in a spiritual, a mystical world that exists outside of the reach of science, right? People tend to be either or in their worldview. That's not all people. Some people have found the way to blend, right, a scientific and a spiritual or mythical or mystical reality together. But people tend to be science, spirituality, or religion in their worldviews. Here's another example of how we can think about worldviews. Do you believe that all humans are created as equals, or intrinsic differences among various, or are there intrinsic differences among various, perhaps, castes or races or genders, right? All humans are created as equals, or there are differences between us, and those differences should be recognized, and maybe not in a discriminatory way, but in some places that's exactly how that works, right? So it's looking at egalitarian versus, different kinds of systems. Also, when we think about meaning, for you, where does meaning come from? Does it come from what you do, or does God give your life meaning, right? Does your occupation give you meaning? Does God give you meaning? What or who gives you meaning? And so this answer is going to be different for everybody. There's going to be similarities, of course, but we might not all use the same terminology, the same way to describe things. It's not to say that, in the United States, for example, 300 and something million people, there are 300 and something million world views. I mean, to a certain degree, but there's so much overlap that it's not going to exactly be that way. It's not as if our worldview is just like a fingerprint or a snowflake. It's not that unique, right? So when we explore our worldview, what this leads to is our ability to discover the assumptions that we hold about the world and how it works. Right? We hold assumptions. It's based on the way we were raised, where we were raised, the system, the religious system, the family system, right? The nation, the city, the county. This has an impact on the assumptions that we make about how the world works. Exploration can also lead to considering alternatives to those assumptions, right? You start to think about, oh, well, I think and believe this way, and that person thinks and believes this way. What's wrong with that, or what's good about that, or what can I learn from it? So we start to be maybe more flexible and less rigid or fixed in our worldview. We're able to examine the factual basis for our assumptions, right? And maybe what we discover is there aren't a lot of facts undergirding the assumptions that we make. It's just based on what we've been told, what we've experienced, because just because we've experienced something doesn't actually mean that it's a given capital T truth of reality, right? It's my reality, but it doesn't mean that it's the reality. Another thing that we can do when we explore our worldview is we can dislodge our misconceptions about people, about groups of people, about other beliefs, systems of thought, right? So we're able to dislodge any misconceptions that we might have. We can also gain agility in adopting a variety of viewpoints, right? That's not to say that we're without a view or without a worldview, without a paradigm. It's that we're able to maybe recognize nuance and contextualization and complexity, right? And not so rigid in the right, wrong, left, right, black, white, right? We can get out of that and be more open to variety of viewpoints. Doesn't mean we take them. It doesn't mean we ascribe to them, but we can recognize that other people have them, just like we want them to recognize that we have our viewpoints as well. And then ultimately, what we're able to do is revise our worldview to better align with reality, right? Because the more out of step with reality we are, the more difficulty we're going to have in our life, period. Getting along with others and just dealing with the fact that things are happening. It doesn't mean we like them, doesn't mean we don't want to work towards change, but when we can accept reality, right? Radical acceptance is something that I teach in my psychoeducation courses. It's like when we can just accept what is, then we can move on to, well, what do we want to do about it? But first we have to gain that acceptance. There is a worldview exploration course. I'm going to put a link in the, let's see if I can do it. A link in the chat. See, I think I can do it. This is where you can go and take a worldview exploration course to find out. Did that pop up in the chat?
It sure did, and I will also be sure to include these in the notes when we put this up on YouTube and our other social media.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like basically you go there and you answer some questions and it'll tell you, right, what your basic worldview is, and then you can see it. Does that make sense? Does that fit me? Is it possible that I'm misaligned somehow? Or you might come to the conclusion like, yep, I'm fine. That's perfectly fine for me, right? But at least exploring it and discovering what other possibilities there are might be, useful, but also fun. So I invite you to do that. So you can find out what is your worldview. Because when you find out what your worldview is, you're going to be learning about other worldviews. And you can basically be like, oh, okay, So when it comes to this topic, this is my belief about it. And then now that person, when it comes to this topic, this is their belief about it. And that person, this is their belief about it. And it lets you at least have an understanding of people have different opinions and ideas about beliefs and about reality. And the goal is, I think, to gain empathy and compassion towards how people come to their views, because you're gonna learn how did you come to your views, and so maybe there's trial and error. So other people have trial and error. So it's a built-in system of empathy and compassion. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some different types of worldviews, just so you can get an understanding of them. So types of worldviews. So the first is attitudinal, right? So this is certain types of thinking, if that makes sense. So an attitude is an approach to life. It's a disposition. It's just certain ways of viewing the world, right? So the attitudinal worldview is typically what tends to govern an individual's approach or understanding, thinking, and feelings about something. So for instance, people with an optimistic worldview will tend to approach things with a positive attitude, right? They'll assume the best about people versus the worst. They won't be pessimistic, right? So they'll approach, rather than approaching people from a pessimistic or negative viewpoint, they'll approach people and things from a more positive or optimistic worldview. So some people's worldviews are governed by this way of thinking. Other people, their worldview is based on ideology, right? So ideologies are sets of beliefs, values that a person or group has, right, for what is normal in their society, in their family, in their faith system, right? So typically ideology is used to describe systems of ideas and ideals which are going to form the basis of, say, economic or political theories, right? But an ideological worldview can also arise out of things like thinking about private ownership, right? Competition, right? You hear people have these discussions, these debates on these really big topics, right? So, for example, a capitalist believes that a system that emphasizes private ownership and competition in the pursuit of profit ends up with the best outcomes, versus a socialist, a person with an ideological worldview that's a socialist, is going to believe that a system that emphasizes collective ownership, cooperation, and pursuit of shared resources ends up with the best outcome, right? So they're two very different systems, but they're both ideologically driven. Another type of a worldview is a philosophical worldview. So this is typically, it can be referred to as a collection of answers to fundamental questions, right? So a school of philosophy is a collection of answers to these questions. Questions that we might have about the universe, or things, common concepts that are normally grounded in reason, right? They arise from these influential philosophical teachings or philosophy, the philosophers that we've been introduced to throughout our life, through schooling mostly, right? So an example might be postmodernist, right? Postmodernism is a philosophical, system that one can have a worldview governed by. So a postmodernist would argue, for example, against what are called meta or grand narratives of earlier schools of philosophy, like, say, liberalism, right? They're gonna argue in favor of pluralism and a more epistemological argument, right? Lived experience. If you've heard people say that, well, my lived experience, right? So that's standpoint epistemology. That's a postmodernist philosophical worldview. Whereas liberalism is more of a political and moral philosophy, right? It's based on liberty and consent of the governed, equality before the law, right? So people are going to have a worldview that's based on a philosophical system. Others are going to have worldviews that are based on religious concepts or religious teachings or religious system, right? So religion is a set of beliefs. It's a system of behaviors and practices. They're going to relate to things like the supernatural, the transcendental, spiritual elements. So religious worldview then is one that's grounded in religion. That's either an organized religion or something that's less codified, right? That's not a larger system like the Roman Catholic Church, right? The Evangelical Church, Lutheran Church of America, right? It's something. So there's these different systems, religious systems. So, for example, individuals who would consider themselves followers of Abrahamic religions, right? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they tend to have a set of beliefs and practices from their scriptures that they believe have been given to their prophets from God, right? That's how those systems work, right? And so their interpretation of the scriptures are then going to define their worldview. So right? So we have this attitudinal, we have ideological, we have philosophical, and we have religious. Sorry, my neighbor's knocking. I had to tell him to go away. So these are the different ways that people's worldviews come to be, right? And so it's possible that there might be some combinations of these, but people tend to be grouped into one of these categories that's the overarching, not significance, would it be the overarching, I'm losing my words right now, but influence on their worldview. So when you're taking that what is my worldview quiz, you're going to see some of this information, and you're going to be able to it's going to help you determine which of these worldviews are the dominant for you. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to be talking about core values. Another way to talk about core values is as a moral compass, right? A strongly held belief about what is valuable, important, or acceptable. Oftentimes, we don't know what our core values are until we bump up against them. We'll just be going along in our everyday life, and somebody will do something or say something. We'll encounter a place, and we'll have a visceral reaction to it. Like no, right? And then if we stop and reflect, we would recognize, oh, that's a core value for me. But we don't often do that. We just kind of react to our no versus stopping and reflecting and looking at what we're doing and then responding, right? The difference between reacting, knee jerk, versus responding, taking time back from a situation, processing it, and then responding, right? So a strongly held belief about what is valuable, important, or acceptable. So let's talk about, on the next slide, some common core values. Common core values. So the first one is cultural, right? So cultural values, these are core principles and ideals that an entire community would exist by, right? So in some places around the world, there are small enough groups that almost everybody in that group is governed by a very specific set of core principles and ideals that are culturally bound, right? And the same is true to a certain extent in larger societies, but there's so many competing cultures or so many different cultures that it's not going to be shared to the same degree, right, as it would be in a smaller community. In a cultural sense, when we're looking at core values, there's going to be a difference between the views of, for example, being versus doing, right? So a culture that values being is going to focus on simply just being in the world, understanding the world, valuing concepts such as like living together in harmony, peace, egalitarianism, rather than trying to, say, exploit or alter the world to fit a certain view, right? If culture values doing, then they're more likely to be to encourage people to be assertive, and that people can, not only can but should alter the world to achieve their goals. This doesn't have to be a sinister thing, a negative thing. It's just, it's pull yourself out by your bootstraps, right? Is a doing culture. And that tends to be, a fairly predominant culture in, at least here in the United States. And I'm not sure about the rest of the Western civilization. Another part of cultural core values is humane orientation. So a culture that values humane orientation would emphasize things like the importance of viewing others humanely, right? Or as some people might say, being pro-human, seeing the human in front of you, right? A human who has faults versus a bad person, right? A human who has done something versus a person who's just evil, right? And being able to separate out those two things. So a humane orientation would promote empathy and altruistic behaviors, harmony among different peoples, different races, different religions, different cultures, right? So a high humane orientation value also would emphasize the importance of people helping each other out, right? Being the good Samaritan, for example, right? This is a natural element of a society that has a humane orientation. This is not the same as a culture that would rely on intervention from outside, right? Outside of its culture, right? A government or other powers to come in and determine how people are treated, right? It comes from internally. Another way to look at what a core value is what we'd call like the indulgence versus the restraint, right? So in a culture that values indulgence, they would emphasize the importance of personal enjoyment and pleasure, right? So that's more of a hedonistic kind of culture, right? Pleasure seeking. But a culture that values restraint is going to emphasize being a bit more restrictive on those luxurious indulgences, right? So pleasure seeking activities would generally be discouraged. And now you can go really extreme, right? From completely austere to hedonistic, and most people are living somewhere in between those two extremes. But in some cultures, they really do emphasize one or the other extreme. And so it's like, for you, in your set of core values, do you find that you're more indulgent or you're more restrained? Have you found a way to balance those things? Let's look at the next section, which is the moral or ethical set of core values, right? So a moral or ethical system of core values is based on a set of principles, right? These principles are going to guide us in how to evaluate right from wrong, right? And a lot of it has to do with our ability to process that information in our brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is not wired up into the rest of our brain typically until we're in our mid to late 20s, right? It's like mid 20s, early to mid 20s for women typically, and mid to late 20s for men, right? So our ability to know right from wrong, truly, not just through coercion and fear and behavioral conditioning with children, but literally to be able to know the difference between right and wrong and consequences happens in the prefrontal cortex, which is not accessible to people before that time, right? Before they're sometime in their mid to late 20s mostly, right? So a moral value then would refer to a set of principles that guide an individual on how to evaluate these things. What's right, what's wrong? And then that helps us justify our decisions and our intentions and our actions. It also helps us to define the personal character of a person, right? If we're aware of these things in ourselves and we're also able to be aware of them in other people, we'd be able to size people up, right? And know if we're in the company of somebody who's an honest person, a dishonest person, right? A reliable person, an unreliable person, a dependable person, an undependable person, right? And so when we're engaging with people, whether it be at work, out in our community, in our family, the ability to discern and differentiate between these different types of people or the motivation that people have, whatever their moral compass is. It's just helpful to know, because we might not want to engage with people who are, living off a completely different moral compass from us. Maybe it's just not really worth the effort. Maybe it's not worth all the headache and heartache that it would cause, right? So an individual who has a high moral value is typically going to be a type of person who displays characteristics such as integrity and courage, respect, fairness, honesty, compassion, right? This is a high moral person, right? So our moral values are connected to fundamental human emotions, and we experience those because that's what motivates us in the things that we do, how we behave, right? How we think, how we feel. It's all integrated in. We might not be consciously aware of it. Like a lot of this is happening unconsciously, but it's part of our system. It's part of our makeup, right? Of people. So when we look at religious core values, right? So again, a religion is a set of codes. People adhere to them, right? Scriptural codes is one way to think about that. For some people, part of their religious values is love, especially to neighbor, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Or charity, right? The importance of helping other people, either physically, financially, both, right? And then mercy. Mercy is a key component, key value of people who have a more of a religious setting on their values, right? So mercy is what refers to our capacity, just as people, to be able to understand others, forgive them, right? It's that compassion, that empathy, forgiveness. And then there's just what would be considered like traditional values. I mean, this might be a bit of an overstatement in some ways. I don't want to, I'm talking an absolutist or relativistic way, but just to, basically posit that there's something called a traditional set of core values. So where is this coming from? Well, for some people, it's their philosophical system, right? Our worldview and our core values are intrinsically linked together, right? So if we're influenced by a religious system or a philosophical system or a cultural system, our core values are typically going to fall in line with that, right? So, for example, a person with traditional values has ideals and values that are held because of a long history, right? Like patriotism, right? Might be considered one of these traditional values, to be patriotic. Whereas in contrast, somebody who holds progressive values might, right, is not based on tradition usually, right? Because progressive, right, to progress, for progress, to progress. So it's a value that might be based on a newer system versus an older system, right? Judeo-Christian such and such, right? Like that's an older system. What is a newer system? Postmodernism, although philosophical, right? It's not traditional because it's not coming from an older place in history, right? So parts of a traditional value system might encourage things like courage and kindness, patience, integrity, appreciation, forgiveness, love, growth, listening, respect, right? So these are some of the core values that are aligned with somebody who has a traditional system of core values. Again, I could spend all day long. We could probably do a whole college semester course just talking about core values, but this is just an introduction so that you can get a better understanding of, if you're unfamiliar with what your core values are, you can go online and do a search for what are my core values, and you can find out what they are. Typically what I've seen people do is they'll see a list of like 100 core values, and somebody will say, okay, take this sheet of paper and circle your 10 core values. And then they'll say, okay, now cross off 5 of those. Now you're left with 5 core values. And then they'll say, okay, shrink that down to 3, right? And it's a way for you to understand, like, what's the most important thing to you, right? Is it charity? Is it courage? Is it patriotism? Is it freedom? What is your core value and the other core values? So that's one of the ways. You can find lists of core values all over the internet. You can do that exercise for yourself to determine what your core value is. Let's go ahead to the next slide. We're going to just briefly talk about moral foundation, because this is a very big topic and I'm not an expert in it. So I'm just going to do a cursory example of some moral foundation. So what is a moral foundation? Application of critical analysis to specific events to determine what is right or wrong, right? So it's like being moral is determining right from wrong. Well, a moral foundation is what we're using to make that determination, right? So it's like, what is your moral foundation? And why does it matter? So let's go to the next slide to look at. This is based on Jonathan Haidt's work, his moral foundations theory, right? So this is a social psychological theory. It's intended to explain the origins of and the variation in human moral reasoning. This is based on innate modular foundations, right? So you can see on the slide that we have 5 core moral foundations in this theory: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So let me just give you a brief description of each. So the moral foundation of care is cherishing and protecting others, right? It's the opposite of harm, if that's an easy way to remember it. Fairness or proportionality is another descriptor, is rendering justice according to shared rules, right? It's the opposite of cheating, right? It's like if you're playing a board game, so to speak, there's rules to that game, right? And you abide by the rules. You don't cheat, right? So your moral foundation is about being fair, right? And proportionality is about how things are distributed, right? It's about fairness. Loyalty or in-group, right? So standing with your group, whether that be your family, your nation, right? The opposite of this would be betrayal, right? Because you don't stand with your group. You're not loyal to your group. So it would be considered a betrayal, right? From the group, right? The in-group, out-group cognitive distortion of seeing people in that way. Then there's authority or respect, right? So this is submitting to tradition, a legitimate authority, right? So the opposite of that is subversion, right? You don't submit to tradition and legitimate authority, meaning you don't recognize, the president of the United States, or you don't recognize your local police department, right? You don't have respect for their authority, and you don't recognize their authority. People who have authority or respect as a moral foundation do respect those things. And then the last one, the 5th one, is sanctity or purity, right? So this is an abhorrence for disgusting foods or things or actions, right? It's like people who they hear something, they see something, and they do the little thing with their nose, like they get that look of disgust, contempt, right? And so some people are very much governed by this sense of what is sacred to them, what is pure. And so basically these 5 foundations are clustered together. So when you can go to Jonathan Haidt's website, and I forget what it's called. Maybe somebody will put it in the chat, but it's like where you can go and take your own "What are my moral foundations" test. And the way, if I remember correctly, there's people who are conservatives tend to have within their moral foundations all of these things, all of them. Whereas people who are considered like progressives only have two of them. And I'm trying to remember which two they were. I think it was care and fairness. I think care and fairness are the two that perhaps progressives, maybe even liberals, hold, and they don't hold loyalty, authority, or sanctity as part of their moral, makeup. Whereas people who are on the more conservative side take all of these, but give a bit more to loyalty, authority, and sanctity, right? So that's an interesting difference, and I think Jonathan Haidt talks about how that manifests in the world. So if you are a person who finds that all of these are part of who you are as a moral person, and you're engaging in a dialogue or a discussion, a debate, right, an argument with somebody who's only looking at care and fairness as the two primary things that determine how they're making sense of the world, it's going to be a difficult conversation, right? So knowing this, right, having this information, it lets you know, like, oh, okay, so this person's really focused on things being fair, right? When they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, equity, that's that fairness component. And why? Because I care about how other people are experiencing their life, right? Of poverty or homelessness, whatever it is, right? So it's just to keep it in mind, right? Doesn't mean you have to all of a sudden change what your moral foundations are, but it helps you to know, just like core values, right, and worldviews, it helps you to know what's motivating other people when they're challenging you. So then you can just put into your mind, like, oh, okay, this person is coming from a place of caring and fairness. Fine, I value caring and fairness. And then you can affirm, it sounds like you really care. It looks like you're really looking to make things fair, right? You can just affirm. That'll put people at ease a little bit, might get them a bit off of their, attack mode if that's what they're doing. So just some side notes there. Why don't we go to the next slide? So we're talking about conflict here, right? Conflict mitigation more than management in some ways, but there are conflict management styles. There's a bunch of different options or different, I guess, types, but there's one primary one, and I'll introduce you to that in a moment. But conflict, it's like we can either manage conflict, we can resolve conflict, we can transform conflict, we can mitigate conflict. So mostly what we do is mitigate conflict, right? We go to work and there are conflicts at work, and we don't always have the time and energy, bandwidth, or necessity to figure out how are we going to resolve this. We just need to figure out how to mitigate it and move on, right? We're not going to be able to take the time that it needs to be able to resolve conflicts, to transform conflicts. In our families, we're managing conflict a lot, right? So just knowing the difference between, when you're in the grocery store, are you going to resolve that conflict you're having with somebody in the checkout line? Probably not. But you can mitigate it by reframing, shifting the conversation, moving to another line, right? You can do those kinds of things, right? So conflict management. So the different ways that individuals address, engage in, and resolve conflict, right? So you might already have a good sense of how you address, engage, and resolve conflicts. And that's good. A lot of people don't. Inevitably, conflict is going to arise. We will never be able to eliminate, eradicate, get rid of conflict. It is not only ever present, it is necessary, right? Conflict is what challenges us to grow and to go beyond our limitations, and to make changes in our life, right? Most change occurs because of a conflict. Not all conflict doesn't have to be seen as a negative thing, right? Conflict can also be a very positive thing, right? Just think of the ebb and flow, the in and out of the waves, right? Big tall wave comes crashing in, comes to the beach, and just slowly rescinds, right? It's like, is it dangerous? Yeah, it can be, right? You get if you're surfing out there in 100-something foot wave, right? But our ability we can learn how to manage and mitigate these conflicts. So let's go to the next slide and look at some of the primary, right? These are the primary ways that people manage conflicts. And when I'm done with this, I'm going to give you a conflict styles assessment link so that you can answer some questions and find out what's your primary way that you manage conflict. And what I mean by primary versus say secondary is when something is bumping up against or pushing up against your core values, and you have that knee-jerk reaction to want to you want to react to it, you're typically going to react using your primary, right? And so that might mean your primary is to accommodate, right? So accommodation is a style of conflict management where it's useful, right? There's no good or bad here. We have to know when and how to use these things. So an accommodation style of conflict management is really good for situations where you don't care very strongly about the issue, right? As the other person does. Like you can just let it go. You're not that invested, right? You don't want prolonged conflict, right? It's not worth your time, your energy. You can just let it go. So you can accommodate. You don't want to be dishonest. You don't want to agree with somebody if you don't agree with them, but you can find ways to accommodate what a person is saying, right? To be more cooperative with the person. Now, some people are accommodating, and it is because they fear conflict, right? So the difference between being accommodating because you're conflict adverse and choosing to accommodate in a particular conflict, right? So you have to know the difference. And of course, you have to, do a whole course of study in conflict management, but you can find out from this assessment where you naturally stand on how you respond to things, right? So accommodation, it's an option that you choose when you want to keep the peace. That's really good for in a family to a certain extent on certain issues, right? It's the old adage of knowing when to pick your battles. That's another way to describe accommodation, right? This is typically when there's a small conflict, not when there's a big one, right? Small conflict. The next conflict management style is avoidance, right? Avoidance. So this style, what we aim to do is just reduce conflict because that's what we think we're going to do when we ignore it, right? We think, well, we'll just ignore it. We'll move away literally like to another state or away from that person where we're standing at the moment, right? We'll leave, we'll go away. We'll just avoid it altogether. And this can be an effective style if you're building in like a cool down period. Sometimes people want to build a cool down period without, like taking a break, without announcing it. Like, can we take a time out? They just might use some sort of avoidance tactic, like, I have to run to a meeting right now, but I'll call you when I'm done, or I'll come back then, right? It's a temporary avoidance measure so that you can get away from the conflict and regroup to determine how am I going to respond to this, right? If you're the type of person who just generally avoids, just like accommodation, if you generally avoid conflict because you're conflict avoidant or adverse and you just don't know how to deal with it or want to, then it's probably a style of conflict management that won't serve you very well in a lot of cases, right? A lot of situations. Because avoidance should not be seen as a suitable, resolution to conflict, right? It can be a short term. The next is compromise, right? So this is when people are trying to find a middle ground, right? So you want both parties, so to speak, right? Because you use this, a lot of times this comes up when we're doing a mediation or negotiations, right? So you're asking people to find a middle ground, right? You concede some of what you want and you concede some of what you want, and we try to come up with a solution that can be agreed upon, right? generally this concept of compromising is called lose-lose, because you're losing key parts of what you actually want. You're giving up and you're giving up. Oftentimes people think compromise is the highest form of conflict management. It's not, right? Because when you lose-lose, you're likely to have resentments in the long run, right? So compromise can be used, especially if there's a time crunch, right? Or when something just needs to happen, right? You need to move on. It's you're entrenched in something and you need to move on from it. But again, it can lead to resentment, and it should be used sparingly, right? Compromise should be used sparingly. Then there's competition, right? So this is not uncommon to people, right? So it's like you have a viewpoint, you have an interest, you have a desire, that there's something you want, and you just go after it, right? And you just mow people down as you're going after it. You don't really care, right? You can see on the slide, what is it, like a shark or something is the competitive, right? It's just going after it. It's being very driven. That's not a bad thing in certain situations, but having a competitive conflict management style in a marriage, for example, that's not very helpful, right? In the workplace, no, that's not going to make you everybody's favorite person, right? So it's knowing when to use these. And again, this is a whole nother course, but it can be useful at certain times, but typically it's not going to be very helpful. It's typically considered very unpopular, right? This should also be a sparingly used conflict management style. And then finally, there's collaboration, right? So when we collaborate with other people, we're trying to find a solution that meets all of the parties' needs. And this can happen, it just takes more time, right? Some of the other ones we're talking about, like, it's short term. Collaboration is something that takes more time. And it's something you would want to engage in if you're invested. You're invested in the person. You're invested in the relationship. You're invested in the project. You're invested in the outcome, right? If you're truly invested, collaboration is the key. This is a win-win solution, right? Compromises lose-lose. You're giving up things. You don't give up in collaboration. You find a way. It's a very transformative way to look at the conflict. You go outside of the box, as we used to say, right? So, but I want to make it clear that the ability to use all of these styles is important given the circumstance, right? So one isn't better than the other, even though it kind of sounds like collaboration is, but collaboration doesn't fit all conflict scenarios. So I want to make that, that point clear. This is important, right? Collaboration is important or appropriate when there's like multiple people involved or multiple perspectives that need to be addressed, right? That's when you're going to want to be looking at it. When there's again, like in a marriage, in a family, these things are important. So 5 conflict management styles. Let me grab up that link really quickly. This is the conflict styles assessment. Let me go and put it in the chat box. And you can go to the next slide because I'm going to be right there. Conflict management styles. All right. So we're just about at the end. I'm going to cover just a little bit of well-being, right? And so what do we mean, right? I'm a clinician, licensed clinical social worker. When I talk about well-being, what do I mean, right? And so what I mean by well-being is thinking about our ability to regulate emotions, right? And the ability to manage emotions as they arise, as they're emerging, right? And it takes a lot of practice to be able to recognize that an emotion is arising and to notice it and to stop and to figure out, why is this emotion emerging and what do I need to do about it versus it emerging and just going with it, right? Again, reacting and responding. Just another example of that, right? Our ability to manage our emotions. And the good news is we can all learn how to regulate our emotions, right? You can go and there's all kinds of, continuing education courses and books you can read and workshops you can take on how to regulate your emotions. You can go see a dialectical behavioral therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist, and you can learn how to regulate your emotions. It's a good thing to learn because we're not going to get rid of conflict in our lives. We're not going to get rid of people that we don't like in our lives, right? So we need to be able to figure out how to be with other people. And that means we need to be able to control how we behave in those situations. Distress tolerance, right? Our ability to navigate the never-ending ebbs and flows of life, right? We will forever be dealing with distress and stress in our life, right? So we can build up a tolerance for that. That doesn't mean that we have to accept bad behavior. It just means that we're not going to react to bad behavior. We're going to respond to it and say, the way you're treating me right now, it's unacceptable. And I'm going to leave now, versus shouting obscenities at people or punching them in the face, right? It's like we can learn how to tolerate the distress so then we can respond to what's actually happening in front of us. Conflict mitigation, we already talked about that, right? The different strategies that we deploy so that we can maintain our relationships, right, with people in our personal and professional lives, right? We need to be able to figure out how to move on and not hold grudges and not, responding kind to people who are misbehaving towards us, right? To rise above that and move on. Stress management is a key component of well-being. Like, what is it that we do to reduce the manifestation of stress on our bodies and our minds, right? Like, what do you do? How do you mitigate, right? Because we deal with stress and strain every day, some of us all day long. So we have to have a way to mitigate that so that it's not just compounding on our body and on our minds, right? So for a lot of people, they use mindfulness techniques, meditation, breathing, stretching, body scans, progressive muscle relaxation, right? Taking walks, exercising, healthy diets, good hydration, right? These are ways that we can mitigate some of the physical and mental impacts of stress in our lives. So I want you to think about what's your go-to strategy, and hopefully it's a healthy one, right? And then sleep improvement. That's the last thing I'll cover. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I do full 1 and 2 hour courses on sleep alone. It's so important. Sleep science is a young science, no more than 30 years old. We're learning more and more about how important sleep is. But what research has definitely shown is that when we have a dysregulated circadian rhythm, right, we have a clock, so to speak, in our brain that is noticing through the optic nerve lightness and darkness, and we have these hormones that are sent through our system, right? And we have things that we take in, for example, caffeine, right? So our body releases a chemical called adenosine when we wake up, and it's in our bodies, right? It's being produced in our bodies and released over the course of 8, 10, 12 hours, right? But the receptors in our body where the adenosine goes into get blocked with caffeine molecules. So if we're taking in caffeine throughout the day, we're blocking the adenosine receptors. And adenosine that's released during the day, and then the melatonin that's released at night when we're dimming our lights, right? As soon as I'm done with this, I'm turning off almost every light in the house because I'm going so far into the evening without melatonin being released, right? And the only way I'm going to be sleepy, not tired, but sleepy, is with my adenosine and my melatonin being at a high enough level in my body, right? So sleep is just a biochemical process. And so when our circadian rhythm is dysregulated, all the other systems in our body become dysregulated, right? Our immune system, our digestive system, our endocrine system, right? These things regulate our mood, our appetite, our hunger, right? Our satiation, our blood sugar levels, right? So it's like people who have poor sleep habits also end up with serious mental health and physical health, ailments in their life. So they've been able to put these things together. So getting a good night's sleep every single night is ideal, right? We do our best, but I'm not going to go into details about sleep. I could, but I won't, right? But I've presented you with so much information. So why don't we go to the next slide? Because really what I want to know from you is if you have any questions for me.
Zander, I want to go back a couple of slides. There's something that was an aha moment for me here, and since I can control the slides, I'll show you where it was. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's here on this conflict management style. And one of the things that's been so critical for me for knowing myself, and it was such an aha moment, even, before you having this conversation, is the core values. Okay. And so I learned this namely through Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly, I believe is what the name of it was. And it seems so simple. Okay. Like you said, there's a sheet of, and I'll put a link in this, by the way, for people who are looking for resources on this after the recording. But, like you said, a page of 100, you narrow it down until you come to 3. But that has been so revolutionary in my life, because when I know my 3, by the way, my 3 are love, kindness, and stewardship. And so when I'm acting unkind or unloving, like that's almost my mantra: love, kindness, stewardship, And so why this conflict management style really stuck out to me was because I see myself, depending on my values, which I think is what you were getting at, depending on my values, moving along that scale on where I'm at. So I'm accommodating when, someone is, the relationship is very important to me. It's a very loving relationship. I'm going to react more accommodating, but when it's something that is testing my values, then I'm going to, be more aggressive. But then also, I saw myself moving in so many things I was thinking about on that scale. And I know that we have perhaps, one strong conflict style management versus another. But I think that also, this idea of knowing yourself and knowing your values, I really kind of put those two together. That was my aha moment here, was how my values reflect my conflict styles.
Absolutely. Well, we may have a default, but that doesn't mean that we can't shift it, right? It takes a lot of intentionality. I'll just go back to something you just said. Just because something is simple doesn't mean it's easy, right?
Right.
So something could be simple and not easy. And so our values are our compass. It's what directs us in life. But things like a conflict management style, we can shift to learn how to be more collaborative versus avoiding, right? We can learn how to do that. And we practice that. We start practicing that with somebody that we love and care about, who loves us and cares about us, so that we can make mistakes and they will have the grace to let us make those mistakes. They know that we're not attacking them, right? It's like some of the things you do in either couples counseling or couples communication skills building sessions. You learn how to do these things in this really safe environment with somebody leading it so that it doesn't get all blown up. And so you can shift, right? You can shift how you respond to people. You go from a reactionary state to a response state and shift the always being highly competitive or always being avoidant. And know that those two things are creating a complete breakdown in your relationships. And so the reframe comes from, well, do I want to be in relationship with this person? So now I need to do something to make the relationship better from my from my angle. There's a type of couples therapy called emotionally focused couples therapy. And there's a book written called Hold Me Tight. And in this book, they talk a lot about how couples are doing a dance and they get into a pattern or a habit of one is always the leader and one's always the follower, and things like that. And so it's like you have to like change the dance, change the dance.
Or change. Yeah. Someone once said to me, like, change the tape that's running in your head. Like sometimes you've got the same thing on repeat, Yeah. We've got, let me read a great question from our audience. So this person says, I recently read that as we age, we prefer a more cooperative style of conflict management, and that we use more we and us pronouns, perhaps demonstrating an increase in our concern for relationships and caring for others over the self. Do you think we can speed up that process, or do you think we have to live longer to get there? That's a really good question.
Well, my first reaction is that that's not going to be an optimum conflict management style all the time. So I wouldn't hold this up as something to strive towards. Because, again, remember the moral foundations. Caring is a highly regarded moral foundation for people who are considered more liberal and progressive, right? So if you're in a relationship with somebody who is more conservative, that's not going to work in that relationship, right? In your workplace, in your family. So there is such a thing as the individual, right? It depends on, in a marriage, yes. In a marriage, there's going to be a lot of we and us, but it's not always going to be applicable. Even in that situation, sometimes people do need to make a stand, and they need to ask for what they want and what they need. And that might create a level of conflict in the relationship. And too often people will try to appease or accommodate to smooth things out. But sometimes we need the waves. Right, we need our boat to be rocked sometimes. We don't want calm waters.
I agree, and I think that you grow in conflict. So there's that. But I think that I'm relating to this question in the sense that as I've gotten older, I've learned my values and what I have, and so I'm not as engaged in so many conflicts. I'm more cooperative unless it really hits up against like my top 3 values. Versus maybe when you're young, and maybe that's why we become more cooperative when we're older, because we're like, oh, this is what makes me tick, versus when you're younger and you're kind of like, everything goes. I feel like there's that maybe.
I think a lot of what this is saying is this is an example of pick your battles. And as we get older, we know, like, I'm okay. It's like in the Quaker consensus model, you're either for it, or you agree, you disagree, or you can live with it, right? And so as you get older, perhaps you get more like, I can live with it, fine. But we have to be careful to recognize that we're doing that intentionally versus, I don't want to deal with this. Or I'm just going to placate the person. Right? So we have to know what our intention is in doing that particular style of conflict management.
I feel like all these things, like these quizzes that we're going to put up on the links, I almost feel like these are the beginnings of any cocktail conversation, right? When we're wondering, like, what small talk do we have? But seriously, like these core values, knowing them yourself first so that you can interact, but like finding that out in another person before you even get into politics or something really heated, so that you can have that both internal knowledge of yourself, but then that knowledge of the other person too, whether or not they have that internal knowledge themselves. That helps you to determine from the get-go, okay, this person is so far out of my moral compass or moral foundation that, unless I just really like getting in a disagreement, we're probably just going to butt heads and I walk on to have a conversation with someone else. I just think that this is so fundamental for how we interact in the world. So with all that said, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but with all that said, I've got one big question for you before I let you turn off your lights and your melatonin.
That's right. I need
I feel like conflict, we see more conflict and we see more division than we did before. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Do we know ourselves less? Or is there more reasons in the world for us to be in a constant state of conflict and stress? Or do you disagree with me? Maybe you don't see more conflict. Maybe it's just that we see it more because we've got more media outlets to see it in. But it feels like we are more divided than before. And so I'm wondering, I definitely think if we know ourselves better, we can address it better. But do we know ourselves less? Is that why there's more conflict? Or is there something out external that's creating, a perceived increase in conflict?
It's a great question. I think that it's like a both and kind of situation, because it's possible that there's been a couple of generations where there's been less emphasis on establishing with children values and morals, right? In school, right? It's like, I remember we learned these things in school. Even as a high school teacher in 2000, I was teaching a class called character development. Like, I don't know if they even have classes like that, 24 years later. So these are things that we used to teach, right? And so they were taught in the home, they were taught in our places of worship, they were taught in school. People were involved in community organizations, like as children, right? Like Campfire Boys and Girl Scouts, right? We were learning these kinds of things, and people are still doing that, but I think that the advent of social media and the sort of the broadcasting of, I think that's amped things up, because it brings a lot more to our attention. And quite honestly, I think that I have no way to verify this, but I'm somewhat convinced that the majority of all of the nastiness on social media is like teenagers just having a gag, right? Like, because it's like, how do we know how old these people are? People who are just posting really obnoxious, attacking kinds of things. I'm like, these must be teenagers, because it's hard for me to imagine that, rational adults. But maybe that's it. Maybe rationality is waning. But I think not only the social media, but I think our more legacy media, right? The news that we take in, right? It's 24/7 now, where it didn't used to be, and it's on multiple channels, and they're, what do they say? If it bleeds, it leads, right? So it's like a constant stream of negativity, all these bad things happening everywhere. And it's like, but we know, you and I and people on this know, like, there's really wonderful things happening all around us. And there's good people all around us. So we just have to choose what we're going to focus on, right? Are we going to focus on the positive and the good? Or are we going to focus on the negative and the bad? We don't have to lose sight of, there's some terrible things happening in our world, but we don't have to focus on it, right? So we have to shift. But that shift could mean that we lose friends, because our friends no longer, we can't have those conversations with them anymore. It's sort of like when you decide you're not going to keep the secret about the alcoholic parent anymore, right? It disrupts the family dynamics, right? So when we want to pull ourselves out of, being armchair warriors, it may upset our group, because they're going to be like, well, what do you think? You're better than us? You're above this all now. And so you can lose connections. But if you focus on what you want to focus on and what's good and what's positive and the direction you want to go in your life, you're going to meet new people who are also focused on similar things. and that will replace what you've lost. But it's a big leap of faith. It's a big risk to take. There's a lot of anxiety or trepidation or fear about doing that. I've done that my whole life, so I just jump off cliffs all the time, and I always land on my feet. I'm like a cat. I've had more than 9 lives, so I'm don't take me as as an example, because I probably jump too often sometimes, but it's just having that ability to recognize, like, you'll be okay if you dislodge from a network, a system, a friend group that's being negative all the time, because there's really wonderful people doing wonderful things, and we should just keep doing more of that,
Well, one other thing that you said that I think I kind of had a light bulb moment was talking about, like, I know that we have, I mean, this phenomenon was back in the 90s, the Robert Putnam, the psychologist, I believe he's a psychologist, wrote Bowling Alone, right? So our community connections, we have been frayed, and I think with social media more and more so. But what I was thinking when you were saying that was, in part, I mean, I think we have to know ourselves first before we can really interact efficiently within society. But we know ourselves. One of the ways that we begin to know ourselves is not only through these quizzes, but is in interaction, real interaction with people, where you are challenged, where there is conflict, and then you get to, you actually get to observe how you interact. And I think that maybe what has been taken from us, if you will, is that, and it doesn't count, or it's not quite the same when you're doing it over Twitter or social media, right? I mean, that conflict is in a vacuum, if you will. And so we know ourselves less, perhaps because we are interacting in meaningful ways less. Would you say? I mean, does that have some teeth to it?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that we can be engaged on a regular basis on a regular base in distractions. That's not the same as engagement, right? We're distracted. We're distracted by binging Netflix series. We're distracted by dead, what do they call that? Doom scrolling on our phones, right? We're distracted by the wackiness on TikTok, right? Versus actually being engaged with people, right? And there's a study out of Harvard University that's been tracking 2 different groups. One is a group of former alumni. It's been 80 years now that they've been tracking this group of kids. Well, they're not kids now. Now they're much older, right? But they tracked them for 80 years. And there was another study that was started around the same time that they joined together some years later, which was more the impoverished kids of the same age in a similar area, right, in the Boston area, and they merged those together, and they looked at them. They would check in with them periodically, and they looked at 80 years out, and what they found is, regardless of the socioeconomic status, the beginning status of these individuals, and where they ended up, the happiness of these individuals was all based on one thing. The happiest of them were the ones that had more social connections. They refer to it as social fitness, right? People who actively engage with other people. They make friends. They go places. They interact with other people. They're not being distracted by their television, by their phone, by the news. And that those individuals and that happiness then has manifestations in their physical health, right? The more socially engaged they are, the less depressed they are, right? The less, there are fewer medical, illnesses they're dealing with, right? So it's now the goal is, well, how do we increase social fitness? It's it's like physical fitness. We have to engage. We have to, exercise our social, skills. And we're not doing that. It's I heard somebody the other day, Brene Brown, as a matter of fact, was interviewing somebody, I forget her name, and she said, it dawned on me one day that I have thousands of friends, but nobody to watch my cat when I go out of town,
Yeah.
or pick
Yeah.
up my medicine when I'm from the drugstore.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
That's
crazy
not
stuff.
engagement. That's not
Right.
connection.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Zander, I thank you so
Of
much. I
course.
will let you get your sleep in for the evening. And for our audience, again, you can find us at ilvalues.org. Sign up for our newsletter to find more of what we are doing, or follow us on Circle, in the Institute for Liberal Values on Circle. Thank you so much, Zander.
Thank you,
Sleep
everybody.
well.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.